evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Astral Perceptions here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. This is our third show, and I was originally planning on continuing my discussion from last week, going over the special paranormal experiences that I've had throughout my life, because there's a lot more to cover. I think I'm going to put that off to next week because I had something happen recording our regular show this week with one of our guests and started talking about UFOs. And he was a psychic medium, very, very nice gentleman, liked him a lot. However, he was very intensely fascinated by the UFO subject, but it became obvious while talking with him that his understanding of it is very rudimentary. And I think that goes for a lot of people that, you know, unless you're one of the folks that are into ufology, maybe members of MUFON, or have been yourselves been experiencers, abductees, whatever you want to call yourself, you're not going to have a full understanding of what is going on unless you've put in the research. I've always been very fascinated by the idea of UFOs, space in general. I'm a space geek. Everything that's going on right now with Mars, with the Perseverance rovers and the Ingenuity helicopter and all of that, I find utterly fascinating. But I also have different opinions on a lot of the things that we are taught and told, and I don't believe that we are being told the truth on a lot of different matters. The same goes with the idea of ETs or extraterrestrials, and they are not exactly what we think they are, at least what mainstream society and the media would have you think they are. Let's face it, ever since Independence Day came out back in the 90s, we've had nothing but movie after movie about alien invasions and aliens abducting people or trying to take over the world, and humanity has to fight back. A lot of ego-centric movies there about, you know, how great the human race is. And it doesn't touch on what we're actually dealing with. In fact, if I had to point to a single movie that I think best captures the UFO phenomenon, the ET phenomenon, I'll look directly at Steven Spielberg's fantastic film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. One of the things about that movie is it took the subject seriously. He looked at it with awe and wonder. And he also got a lot of it right. It was the first movie that really tackled the whole government cover-up situation, when even the talk of Roswell, the Roswell crash in 1947, wasn't really in the public eye back at that time. But yet the movie really focused on the government cover-up, the government looking in, making contact with these aliens, and even the experiencers themselves having a psychic connection after their experiences. Richard Dreyfuss's character, Roy Neary, started having these visions of this tower and this obsession, and turns out everyone who had seen these craft in the movie started feeling the same thing, and they were all being pulled towards what was the finale of the movie at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Again, it was a fantastic movie looking at the benign side of the alien UFO experiences with fantastic special effects. And being a movie guy myself, they still hold up to this day. Douglas Trumbull, it was one of the best special effects artists in the industry. having done 2001: A Space Odyssey, his own movie Silent Running, this one Star Trek Motion Picture. So really realistic effects. Oh, and Blade Runner. I can't forget Blade Runner. Fantastic. So, but I wanted to talk about the subject matter from my perspective. My perspective being that I am not an ET experiencer, not consciously. I don't remember ever having an experience. I have had a couple of strange experiences, and I've had one UFO sighting, and by that I mean it was an unidentified flying objects, as in plural, that I can't explain, but I can't sit here and rule out that it wasn't something man-made or terrestrial. So let me tell you about that experience. This is back in about January of 2018 here in northern New Jersey. My wife and I, around 7 o'clock at night, were driving to go out to dinner to a restaurant. And as we're driving on this one road heading southwest, I looked up in the sky and I saw a multitude of objects. I'm going to say it was about 15 to 20 orangish lights, all flying kind of in formation in a long line, heading towards the northeast. And we were caught in traffic, and I didn't have a place to pull over and stop because I wanted to get out and start taking video of these craft. But I couldn't because I was stuck in traffic that was moving and I had nowhere to pull over. But we watched these craft. They flew for miles. I saw them coming from miles away, and they came right by us, not exactly over us, but off to our left, and then slowly moved past. And if I had to guess, I would say they were about 400 or 500 feet up in the air, and they were stretched out in a line that I would say would be about maybe 700 to 800 feet, maybe 1,000 feet long. And they weren't flying in a perfect line. Some of the objects were close together. Some were moving around each other a bit, but they were all flying in the same general direction. Now, my first thought was these were drones. Somebody was doing a drone display. Yet I rolled down the window and I heard nothing. There were no whizzing of drone propeller blades. And I own a drone, so I know what they sound like. So it was perfectly silent, and they were moving at a steady pace. I would say about 40, 50 miles an hour in the sky. And we just, my wife and I are sitting there staring at them, and we couldn't figure out what they were. They were just orangish, slightly reddish balls of light. They didn't look like craft. They didn't look like anything. Now, you've seen, like during the Olympics, they have these big drone displays, and they have them doing all these wild, funky things. But here's the thing about drones. Drone batteries don't last that long. I have a pretty high-end drone, and my battery lasts 20 minutes. You could fly for maybe like 1,000 feet around before eventually, if it gets out of range of your controller, a lot of drones are programmed to come back. You can pre-program them to fly a certain course. But I've never seen drones fly for several miles in a straight line, going somewhere. Now, it's possible. And again, I have to be realistic here. It's possible that they were maybe something military. We do have the Kittatinny Arsenal not too far away. Maybe they were military-type drones with longer-lasting batteries. But it was just strange. I've lived up here for 20 years, never seen this before, and I haven't seen it since. And as far as myself and my wife, I only know of 2 other people who actually saw them in the night sky that night and said anything about it on social media. So that's my UFO story. Can I sit there and say that they were craft piloted by ETs? Absolutely not. They seemed like they probably were man-made, but I don't know. I can't tell. So it remains a mystery. What's ironic is my identical twin brother, Bill, has actually seen UFOs on several occasions throughout his life. In California, he's seen craft flying over Castaic Lake up in the northern part of the Santa Clarita Valley. We all used to work at Magic Mountain together, Six Flags Magic Mountain in Santa Clarita, Valencia. And one night while he was working on this one lake that they use for water skiing shows, he looked up in the sky and he saw these objects like flying all around each other and whizzing around and doing these acrobatic stunts as they went across the sky. Obviously not a conventional aircraft. So people see these objects all over the place. You can just go on the internet and you can just see tons and tons of photos and videos of strange lights and craft. Now, a lot of them can be explained. More than once, I've seen people post strange, like long elongated trails of light and claim it's a UFO, but I know from personal experience that it's a rocket launch. Having gone camping up in Pismo Beach, not too far away was Point Magoo, and there was the Air Force Base up there, and they would always be doing rocket tests and missile launches. And so I know what they looked like, and so you're able to debunk some of those. But other craft you can't. I remember some of the early videos that I've seen. You have the old pictures taken by Billy Meyer, which, again, I'm going to be talking about a lot of controversial people during this show. A lot of you may think these people are full of it, that they're hoaxers. You know what? That's your right. And I'm not sitting here saying that I believe them 100% either, but there are some interesting cases, and I'm going to bring them up. You are welcome to your own opinion, as always on this show. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. It's not my job to convince you to believe in something that you don't want to believe in. And I'm not even saying that I fully believe in it. But if I find something interesting, I'm going to be open to discussing it further. And so you can look at aircraft photos going all the way back from the 60s and 70s. We saw some photos. There was a documentary I actually saw in the movie theater. It was narrated by Rod Serling, called The Outer Space Connection. And it was about the whole idea of ancient aliens, before the TV show, of course, Chariots of the Gods, visiting Earth, and possibly manipulating and having something to do with manipulating our DNA during our evolution. But in the show, they showed all of these pictures of actual UFO photos taken all over the world. And those always intrigued me. Some of these craft are just really, really fascinating to look at. Now, you have your typical saucer-shaped ones, but then you have, like, the newest videos that has been released by the Pentagon, of all things, of the Nimitz incident that happened off of Catalina Island in California, where two jet fighter craft tracked and recorded these large, what they call tic-tac UFOs. And the speed of these things and the maneuverability of these things blew away our technology, and the pilots were flabbergasted. And afterwards, they were all sworn to silence, but yet later on, the footage leaked many years later, and now it's being openly discussed. And there's even been some programs on NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. Just a week or so ago, he did a segment focusing on this UFO video. And for one of the very first times, they took it seriously, and they didn't do what my friend Bruce calls the snicker factor, making fun of it, which is what the media has always done. If anybody has ever claimed to have seen a UFO or had an experience, they all kind of like chuckle behind their hands, or they play the X-Files theme or whatnot and belittle the whole the whole thing. And that's what the media has always done, instead of trying to investigate and take a lot of these experiences seriously. Because there's so much that happens out there in plain sight, and yet society and our as a whole don't want to accept it, or just want to turn a blind eye and go about their daily job and collect their paychecks and live their lives like they've been taught to do. A government, ever since not only the Roswell incident, but there's numerous incidents of government cover-ups of UFOs either crashing or interacting with our military people. There's the Rendlesham Forest case that happened in England in the early 80s on an American Air Force base. Again, I mentioned my friend Bruce. He was a technician working for a television station and was out working on some electrical relays near an Air Force base in New Mexico, and he watched UFOs flying over the base, and they would scramble aircraft to go after them, and these UFOs would just leave the aircraft in the dust. So what are these? The popular theory is, they're aliens from another planet. And popular culture shows us that they're these short, gray beings, skinny bodies, large heads, big black wraparound eyes. That's the popular theme. Yet, one of the things that I've had the advantage of in doing these radio shows over the last 10 years is I've got to interview a lot of people in the ufology. And not only that, experiencers, people who have had their own experiences. Most recently, I interviewed Terry Lovelace, who wrote the book Incident at Devil's Den, recounting what happened to him and his friend back in the, I believe it was the early 70s, where they had an abduction experience. And they were in the military at the time, too. And after their experience, when they got back to the base, somehow the military knew about it and swore them to secrecy, threatened them, separated them, made sure that they would never talk again, and swore that they should never, ever repeat what happened to another living soul. It took him years to finally come out and start talking about it. And a lot of times people talk about their abduction experiences. They talk about being, some people drive along the road and all of a sudden they see a light in the sky and they stop and look at it, and then they have missing time. And the Betty and Barney Hill case in the 60s is a prime example. They were driving back from, I think, Niagara Falls or Canada down through New Hampshire. They saw these lights in the sky. Next thing they know, there's this craft above them, and then they have missing time. And through hypnotic regression, they both recounted being taken aboard the craft by these beings, given examinations, even being interacted with and talking to the beings, and then they're released and let go. Now, a lot of people think that with these types of incidences, they may be like a one-off, like the aliens come along and they just abduct somebody, take a look at them, they want to examine them, take some DNA from them, and then let them go, and that's it. When the truth is, if you really talk to a lot of experiencers like I have, that this phenomenon is a lifelong experience for them. It's not a one and done. I would say 90% of people who have had close encounters of the third and fourth kind have had lifelong experiences going back into childhood. I'm going to talk a lot tonight about a couple of different people extensively, one being Whitley Strieber. Now, Whitley, his case came out in the late 80s with his book Communion. Now, Whitley was originally a fiction writer. He wrote a lot of horror fiction. He wrote books that they turned into movies. One was The Wolfen with Albert Finney, and another was The Hunger with David Bowie. But then he wrote Communion And it caused a firestorm because he wrote it as nonfiction. And he talked about his very own, first time he could remember, abduction experience in his cabin that in upstate New York. Now, he and his wife lived in New York City, and they would go on the weekends up to this cabin, which was up in the Pine Ridge area of upstate New York, which isn't really far from where I live. It's about an hour and 15, 20 minutes away from me. I've been up there a few times. And they have a reputation of having a lot of UFO activity up there. But in the 80s, when he lived up there, it was nice and quiet, and he had friends over a lot. But then I believe it was Christmas Eve of 1985, he had his first experience where beings came into his bedroom, abducted him, took him aboard the ship, gave him the examination. He was terrified out of his mind, and and he was taken back, and he had definitely vivid memories of this, and it haunted him. It scared the crap out of him. And then he started having multiple experiences beyond that, and then going through hypnotic regression, found out that he had been having these experiences since childhood. In fact, there may have even been his father might have been involved, because his father was in the Air Force, I believe, when he was younger, and may have had something to do with this. And when you talk to a lot of experiencers, they find out it goes along generations of the same families. Whole families get abducted. Even his kids were abducted. A lot of other abductees talk about not only have they had been abducted, their parents may have been, and their own children are also involved in the process. So, what are these beings? Are they visitors from another world, another planet, here conducting experiments here on us humans? Again, in my research, I'm finding it's something much, much deeper than that. And there's a couple of different types of phenomenon that going on. One is the people who are brought on board, not only given full examinations, but they also have genetic material taken in the form of semen. Women have had ova taken, eggs taken from them. So women have reported becoming pregnant without not knowing how they became pregnant, and then after a couple of months they're suddenly not pregnant, as if they were never pregnant at all. And then later on, having an abduction experience and being shown what looks like a hybrid baby. And they are told that this is your children. And why are they doing this? There's a lot about this we really don't know fully what the motivation is for a lot of these races. There's a lot of ideas. Whitley Strieber has his own ideas, and to be quite frank, I followed Whitley's case for about the last, good Lord, 25 years. I read Communion shortly after it came out. I've read his follow-up books on the subject, and I followed his blog posts on his unknowncountry.com website. And his own opinion about what he was dealing with has changed over the years. In the beginning, he was very afraid of them. He didn't know what to make of them, and he thought that their intentions sometimes could have been evil. Now, in later years, he's recognizing that they are very much integrated with us. We are very much more connected with some of these beings that he calls visitors than we realize. And they're very much more involved in the evolution of humanity than we've ever realized. Now, I know a lot of shows like Ancient Aliens and even the writings of Zecharia Sitchin talk about, when he translated a lot of the Sumerian texts and talking about the Anunnaki who supposedly created humans to be a slave race, mining gold for them. There are other stories of human genetic manipulation with humans, being that we are a hybrid race ourselves. You'll kind of notice that there's no other mammal on the planet that looks anything really like us, except you could point at chimpanzees or gorillas, the apes, and yet there are major distinctive differences there. Being that we're hairless, walk completely upright, our bone structure, our opposable thumbs and hands. You can compare a skeleton of a human to a chimpanzee and notice the differences right away, the cranial structure, the brain size. We are a very unique species, and yet there is no other species on the planet like us. Now, we found fossils in the past of other forms of human, earlier forms of human. And if you talk to anthropologists or archaeologists, they all have, up until recently, even when I went to school, they have this nice long timeline of showing how there was a common ancestor, very ape-like, and then it starts evolving. You get Australopithecus, and then Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, and then Homo sapiens, which is us. Well, the problem is that they're now discovering that a lot of these forms of human existed at the same time. In fact, there's evidence that modern types of humans mated with and procreated with Neanderthals. They were intermixing species. Time again. Our version of history is not as linear as we're being taught. I also feel that our human race is a lot older than we're taught as well, because they try to make it seem like civilization didn't come around until about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, with the Sumerians being the first. When now we're finding these older sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was just uncovered several years back, a couple decades ago actually, that dates back to 12,000 years ago. And 12,000 years before there was ever human civilization. Ancient Aliens is very popular on TV, and that show's lasted, 10 years now? And sometimes they've really done some episodes where I've scratched my head and go, guys, you really want to go there? I don't always buy everything they have, and I always can make fun of Giorgio Tsoukalos, who's always on there saying, it's extraterrestrials, it's aliens. No, not necessarily. I think there's a lot more going on, but we'll get into more of that probably in a later show. But it shows there is evidence that we have been involved and dealing with these beings since the beginning of our existence. Even if you go back and look at the Bible, or look at other ancient texts that talk about strange flying machines. Ezekiel seeing the wheel within a wheel, the flying machine that actually came down, picked him up, and took him up into the sky. Same thing with Elijah. You have even in the stories in Genesis, and then the apocryphal books of Enoch, that talk about the Watchers. And who are these Watchers? They weren't called angels, they were called Watchers, and they were looking out over humanity. And the stories that some of the Watchers found the human women desirable, and they came down and quote, took wives of them and had these offspring called the Nephilim, or the Nephilim, and were giants or other types of creatures. Well, the traditional biblical version is very brief on a lot of that. The Book of Enoch goes into it in a lot more detail and talks about how these other beings were interacting with humans. And if you look, even in the traditional book of Genesis, if you go back and look, when God walks into the garden, and this is after Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And this serpent was not a snake. They call it a serpent, but it was not a snake. It obviously had arms and legs, because when God supposedly cursed him, he said, on your belly you'll go, and took the arms and legs away and turned him into a regular snake as punishment. But yet, the serpent was never specifically called Satan or the devil. It was just the serpent. So who was this serpent? There are other stories in Greek mythology of Prometheus, who did pretty much the same thing, did a no-no. The gods did not want humans to have knowledge of things, or they wanted to keep us down. And Prometheus came in and brought fire to us and taught us a whole bunch of things of agriculture. And when the gods found out, he was punished. I forget what they did to him, but it was very gruesome. Of course, typical Greek mythology. But there's lots of different old stories about how we were not meant to be taught. We were meant to stay a certain way as simple beings, and then we were evolved and made to be who we are today, which is more thinking, critical thinking beings and sentient beings that are totally unlike the animals. When God walks through the Garden of Eden, this is where it's funny, where he's talking in the third person, like we. Mankind has become like us now. We need to put a stop to this. We can't allow this. And people are always thinking, oh, well, this is the royal we. Well, the original word for God that was used in the original versions, or the oldest versions that we can find of Hebrew, was Elohim. Now, Elohim had both singular and plural connotations. So what if God that was going through the garden was not the God that we think of today, but one of these beings, part of that whole race of beings that created us? That's a possibility. A lot of people have written about the subject. There's a lot of books out there that talk about it. A friend of mine, Nick Redfern, he's written many books that are on the subject, and even, Eric von Däniken and the Ancient Aliens show, they've all brought this up. Now, a lot of people think this is a lot of bunk and BS, and people who hold very fast to their Christian or Judean faith, again, not trying to convince you of anything that you don't want to believe. That is fine. But there is a lot of evidence out there that is worth discussion and worth looking into. And again, it still doesn't tell us, who are these beings? Are they from other planets? Did they come in spaceships to travel all the way here? Well, science tells you we can't go past the speed of light. So with some of these star systems that they could have come from being tens to hundreds to thousands of light years away from here, travel between the stars seems impossible. And yet we're starting to understand in new theories of space-time, and astrophysicists talk about this, about folding space, being able to, instead of traveling linearly from point A to point B along a flat plane, it's like if you imagine space as a piece of paper, you fold that piece of paper in half and punch a hole through it. The movie Interstellar really did a good job of explaining that when they were trying to go through the black hole, and it's traveling to another part of the galaxy through a shortcut, a wormhole. Even in the Netflix show Stranger Things, which I love Stranger Things, in the first episode when they talk about parallel worlds, is that shortcut going in between our dimension and another dimension. So these beings could be coming from all over the place, from different parts of our universe. But there's also evidence, when you talk to a lot of experiencers, that they could be coming from alternate universes, alternate realities. Maybe some are theorized to even be time travelers. They could be humans from the far future who've evolved into such a way to look like these beings. Now, there are many, many different types of creatures that have been reported that people have seen in these experiences. You have everything from the grays, which is the most popular, the short little guys. But you also have what they call the tall whites, which seem to be the ones that are more in control of these small grays. They look like grays, but they're taller, thinner, can be anywhere from 6 to 7 feet tall. And they always seem to be the ones in charge. There's also a being that looks like a praying mantis is another one that seems to be in charge. Like the grays themselves are more like a drone race, whether they're a biomechanical or clones of some kind or whatnot, but they seem to be more of the worker bees, and there's a hive mentality with them. You have talk of the reptilians. The reptilians, which usually get a pretty bad rap. A lot of people have told negative stories of the reptilians, like they're the ones who are trying to control what's going on in our world and keeping humanity down and keeping everything, keeping us a very negative aspect to us. But I've also heard other stories that people have had positive experiences with the reptilians. There's supposedly an avian, what they call blue avian race, which is a new one to me. But notice how a lot of these aliens seem to, first of all, they're all upright bipedal beings, just like humans. Where on our planet there really isn't any other being like us, but yet these so-called aliens, why don't they look like giant spiders with like 10 legs, or floating bags of like a jellyfish or something like that? Why do they all look what we call humanoid? That could be because maybe we are more like them because maybe they had a hand in creating us. Possibility. Again, according to a lot of people who have had abduction experiences. There's also the fact that they may not be from our physical reality. And again, a lot of abductees, Whitley Strieber, again, I'll point out, even he has talked about the fact that it seems like during a lot of these experiences, people seem to be in an altered state of consciousness, possibly not in our reality per se. Maybe that's why a lot of people don't see these craft. Some people can look up in the sky and one or two people may notice a craft, and other people just act like it's not even there. These beings seem to have the ability to manipulate our minds and our thoughts and control us to a certain extent, which I'm not real happy about myself, but I'd like to be able to have some control and interaction if I ever had that experience. But and in most cases, they're told to forget it. And, we can wonder why we're told to forget it. Well, it's like you want to have somebody have a traumatic experience, return them, and then they're suffering from PTSD, which a lot of people do anyway. The late Dr. John Mack out of Harvard University, he was a psychotherapist who used hypnotism and regression for, he was never really into the whole UFO or abduction scenario, and yet he was brought into it with a few cases, and then next thing you know, he was writing whole books about it, regressing hundreds of people that were involved with these beings. And some of the stories in his books, there's one, Abduction, and the other is Passport to the Cosmos. I highly recommend reading these books because some of the information that comes out in these books is very, very wild and will challenge your belief system. It seems, again, and I know Whitley Strieber has mentioned it, that these beings, or at least some of these beings, seem to be involved with us on a spiritual level. They seem to be very, very involved with our spiritual selves, the soul, our higher selves. Whitley has talked about actually seeing people on board the ships of people that he knew that turned out later that he didn't realize at the time were dead and they had died. And even now, modern day, his wife Anne, who's married to for many, many years, and she passed a few years ago from a stroke, He wrote a new book that came out a couple years ago. Another book I highly recommend called The Afterlife Connection, where he documents his ongoing experiences and communication with his deceased wife. And it's somehow involved with these visitors. Whitley has an implant that was found in his ear. He tried to have it removed, but when the doctor tried to remove it, it kept moving and going deeper inside. It knew what was going on. It didn't want to be taken out. Now, many years later, he says that he has learned how to use the implant and control it, and it's given him a deeper relationship with these beings. Another case I'll talk about, and this is very, very controversial, is the Stan Romanek case. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with the Stan Romanek case, Stan wrote, and his wife Lisa, he wrote a couple of different books. He had experiences for many, many years being abducted and having interaction with these beings, and they were directly interacting with him beyond being an abduction phase. He would even while under hypnosis, having regressions, start channeling these beings that would come through. Now, Stan's reputation took a huge hit a few years ago because he did something very stupid, and I'm going to blame it on that. He said why he did it. I'm going to sit here and say I think he just made a very, very big mistake. He's human, just like the rest of us, and he's not infallible. And I think he screwed up, plain and simple. But during a video interview he was doing, he tried to make it seem like a pencil flew off his desk, where his hand clearly shows him throwing the pencil. Now, he always claimed that he and his wife had been threatened over the years many different times. They were being spied on. They were attacked. Their home was invaded. They had all sorts of different things happen. And he supposedly received a phone call that told him if he didn't do something to try to discredit himself, one of his family members would be killed. Now, that seems like an easy excuse. The simpler explanation is, he was trying to fake something and got caught. And then that threw everything that he's ever said or done into question. Like, was he faking it? Then, ultimately, he was raided by the police, who came in with a search warrant, took his computer, and then they held it for 8 months, and then later came back and said they found kiddie porn on it. And he was charged and eventually found guilty and convicted of child pornography. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, you can believe what you want. I knew Stan and Lisa. I can't say I knew them well. I met them on several occasions. I was at their home when Stan was still going through that whole mess, waiting for the police investigation and waiting to be charged. He was very upset by what was going on. And I always found Stan to be a bit goofy. But I do not believe for 1 second that he had child porn on his computer. It is my personal opinion that despite Stan's flaws and despite some of the things he may have done, he's had genuine experiences. And the reason I can say that is he's had experiences with other people that were there and witnessed it. He's been outside with other people when UFOs have flown over. He is dyslexic and has an 8th grade math level, and yet during some of these trances, he would write out these mathematical equations that were sent out to other mathematicians and physicists who couldn't figure them out. They kind of knew a little bit about what it was, but it was so far beyond what they were able to figure out, and they were still studying it. They had, and he couldn't have done that himself. It was beyond his comprehension. I've seen the drawings in the books, and actually I've been able to figure out a little bit of it, that it was trying to explain a propulsion system very similar to creating that wormhole effect. Really fascinating evidence. He's had photographic evidence, video evidence of a couple of grays, one peeking in his window when he lived in Kansas, and the other in his home in Colorado, where there seemed to be this gray peering in his back door, and then he passed out shortly afterwards. Now, people could say, oh, these were dummies, these were faked, whatever. Yeah, you could say that. But what gets me is all the other evidence around him. Things like they found a bug in the house. Their house was bugged. And they had, as someone who is very familiar with security devices, look at the device, and it scared the crap out of him because it was so advanced. He'd never seen anything like it. So they talked to their publisher, Mark. I won't say his last name, but I know him. He a very nice gentleman. And Mark said, do this. I want you to go to some kind of carrier. Don't tell me where you're going. Don't tell me which one it is. Go and overnight it to me. So Stan and Lisa went, picked a place at random, got a box, put it in it, shipped it out to him overnight. When Mark got the box the next day, and it's funny because Mark showed me the note. He showed me the photos of the note, because when he opened the box, the bug wasn't in there. Instead, there was a rock in there about the same size as the bug, and there was a note in there that said, "We don't think so." As in, somehow it was intercepted and replaced. And yet, through the tracking and everything, they had no idea how that could have happened. So a lot of strange things with his case. But he was discredited and humiliated, and now he's a pariah in the community. I mean, he and his wife Lisa have since divorced. I can kind of understand that. I mean, I don't know what else went on in their personal lives, but with everything going on and what happened with him, I understand it. But they had a lot of other different experiences that, again, were backed up by other people and other witnesses. And his case was one of the most well-documented cases out there. Yet, again, because of the kiddie porn thing, nobody will touch it now with a 10-foot pole. He's dead to the UFO community. But what is the best way in this day and age to discredit somebody and turn everyone against them? Accuse them of pedophilia. Accuse them of, suddenly they find kiddie porn on their computer and they are now a pariah to society. Nobody trusts them. They think they're disgusting human beings. But if it's effective, it's certainly effective. Now, what gets me is the police confiscated his computer and held onto it for 8 months. 8 months. And then they came out and said, yeah, we found kiddie porn on the computer. Yeah, I smell something fishy there. He had several times where they tried to silence him. One time he was out for a walk and a van pulled up and these military guys got out and beat the living shit out of him. They told him to pretty much shut the F up. Stop talking. Even while he was awaiting his trial for the pornography, he had gone to the mailbox and was attacked by a couple of people who he said later were the police, off-duty police. They weren't in uniform, and one of them was supposedly the detective who even was on him on the case, accused him, beat him up so bad, gave him mild brain damage. He had severe brain injury because of it. And yet nobody wants to believe it. It's effectively buried, and that's it. And, so many other different people who have seen things and then had either government people or the so-called men in black show up at their house and threaten their families, threaten them that if you say anything, you'll be killed or we'll kill your family. They won't find your bodies except bones bleached in the desert. They effectively scare people to shut them up, to not talk about it. Yeah, it's all around us. Now, the only other personal experience I ever had, I don't talk about this one too often because it was happening during a point in my life that I'm trying not to think about. I was going through a bad time. But I was at a location that was supposedly a UFO hotspot, and I was out there with friends, and there was a UFO conference going on at the time. And while I was out there, we were sitting out at night. It was this place called the UFO Watchtower. And we were trying to look up in the sky to see, if you could see anything. And it was overcast that night, so we weren't really seeing much. But I'm sitting there and I'm watching the sky, and all of a sudden, I noticed in the clouds a face start to form, and it forms the face of what looks like a typical alien gray. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, this has to be pareidolia, which is like looking at a cloud and thinking it's an elephant or a giraffe or something, some kind of shape. But the way our minds try to take a blob or vaporous shape and try to make sense out of it. So here I'm looking at this cloud, and I clearly see this alien face staring back at me from the clouds. So what do? I close my eyes. I shake my head. I look back up. It's still there in the exact same spot. And I watched it for about another minute, and then it just quickly faded out and was gone. And it wasn't like the clouds were moving, whatever, because it was a uniform gray. You couldn't see, it was at dusk turning into night. You really couldn't see the clouds themselves other than the gray, but I clearly saw this alien face. It was really intriguing. Later that night, I was sitting in my little campsite by myself. My other friends who were in their other campsites up above, they had all gone to bed, but I decided to stay up for a while. And I'm sitting there out for about an hour, and nothing happens. I really didn't see anything. And then suddenly, I just turned my head, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this bright flash of light right next to me. It looked like an orb of light streaking in an arc about 15, 20 feet off the ground towards the ground in a quick flash of arc. I clearly saw this, and yet it wasn't exactly full on. It was in my peripheral vision. So what did I do? I did everything I could to recreate it and turn my head and tried to do the exact same thing. I mean, seconds after it happened. Was it a reflection in my glasses from a light down the way or whatever? I could not recreate it. Now, can I sit here and tell you that, I had ET alien experiences? Absolutely not. But I had strange ones. Can't really explain it. I don't know what to think of that, especially with seeing the face. Was that just my imagination, or was it some kind of confirmation, some kind of connection? And as I mentioned before, I've never had what I would call an abduction experience, nothing that I can remember. I've only seen that one UFO case that I mentioned earlier. And yet I've always been very intrigued with the subject. I'm very, very, very intrigued. And I enjoy talking with the experiencers and the things that they've experienced. And some people have experienced terrifying situations with beings that either seem apathetic or maybe don't seem to have our best interests at heart. Some ufologists, like Dr. Dave Jacobs, he's convinced that these beings don't have our best interests at heart. Some are maybe even controlling humanity, yet there are other races that seem to be trying to help us. Now, I got into a discussion with this guest on our show last night about, disclosure and, all these ufologists that are fighting for the government to release what they know about the UFOs. And I'm on the side that says it's never going to happen. Our government is never, ever, ever going to come out and say, yeah, we fully know about UFOs. We've known about it all this time, because they're afraid of the backlash of what will happen to them. Because if we find out that they've been lying to us all these years, all trust in the government will be gone. We'll wonder what else they've been lying to us about, which for me is pretty much everything. And they also think that the world will panic and that we can't take it, but they think that little of us, that we wouldn't be able to accept it, even though aliens are pretty much a part of our culture, our popular culture with movies and TV shows and whatnot. I think people would be open to it. I think some people would have problems with it, especially super religious people might have problems with it. But then again, the more we learn, the more we'll understand our place in this universe. Now, this is something, again, I originally found it through Whitley Strieber had mentioned it, and then I read it through Colonel Philip Corso, who had an experience of his own while in the military, and had some kind of contact with these aliens. And there's this phrase, and I won't forget it because I think it's very important. Colonel Corso had asked these beings, why they were there, what were they offering us? And their response was, a new world, if you can take it. And that phrase really strikes a chord in me, because it means that they're there. They're working with us, but they're not just going to hand things over. People wonder, well, why don't they just fix all of our problems? Why don't they just land and, cure diseases and work with our government and, unite humanity? And everything that I'm seeing and hearing is the fact that they have kind of like the Star Trek Prime Directive. It's non-interference. They're not going to come in and mess with our society. Yeah, they're kind of messing with individuals and working with people for good or ill, depending on your point of view. But as a society as a whole, they do gentle nudges and pushes. They show themselves in certain areas. They're not going to land on the White House lawn. But remember a couple of years back where there was the UFO several nights hanging over Chicago O'Hare Airport. There was a UFO during one of SpaceX's early rocket tests when the rocket exploded on the launch pad. But yet, when you look at the footage and slow it down, a UFO goes flying past at supersonic speed. You could barely see it. If you're watching the video, at regular speed, you can hardly even see it. It barely registers, but when you slow it down, there it is, crystal clear, flying right behind it. And just as it's flying past, that's when the rocket explodes. Did they do that? There's stories of UFOs supposedly shutting down our nuclear missile silos back in the 70s. Showing that, that they had control, that they could shut us down in a heartbeat. I think they did the opposite with some Russian silos where they started activating the missiles and the Russians were scrambling trying to keep them from launching. It was to show their power, that they had some control. So I really feel like they're interacting with us, but they're interacting with us in different ways. There's Dr. Stephen Greer, who is an emergency room physician, and for the last 20-something years, he's really been pushing the CE5, what he calls it, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, where he's been working to he's lobbying the government. He works with people trying to show connections on how to connect with these intelligences and beings, and a lot of it is on a psychic level, a lot of it is on an interdimensional level. It's really fascinating stuff. I'll have to go into it more on a later show because, once again, I've been rambling on and the hour is almost up, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. What I think I'm going to do in a later show is I'll try to bring on a guest so that we can have more of a two-way conversation, because I may know a lot about the subject, but I'm no expert. And I would really like to be able to have that one-on-one debate discussion to discuss the subject in greater detail. But I would love to hear from our listeners here. If you've had your own UFO experience, I would love to hear about it. If you send me an email to Mark, M-A-R-K, at paukradio.com, or if you have a general comment about the show, even if you want to tell me I suck, be my guest. But I want to hear more from the listeners, from those of you who are listening to the show. If any of this resonates with you, if you have a story to tell, I would love to hear about it. So until next week, I want to thank you all for tuning in to this edition of the Astral Perception Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We're here every Thursday, and I will see you next week with a brand new show. So everyone, you have a great evening, and we'll talk with you soon.